Hello and welcome to the aForm show. My name is Alan George and thank you very much for tuning in. Each week, we sit across from thought leaders and change makers in the architecture and design space of the GCC. We dive deep into their experiences, both professionally and personally, and share their valuable insight as to what makes them tick. Our goal is to add value to your day and help you navigate your own personal creative journey. Finally, the opinions and the views of the guest speakers are that of their own. They do not necessarily represent the views and the opinions of the show or the host. Hello everyone, welcome to today's show. On today's episode, we are excited to welcome Ahmed Bukhash, considered to be one of the leading architects of the city, if not the region. Ahmed completed his undergrad studies in the US at Wentworth University. He then went on to attain his master's degree in Japan, which undoubtedly has left a very lasting impression. We will talk more about this in the episode for sure. Since then, he has contributed to many developers and authorities within the city of Dubai and started up his own practice, Archidentity. So without further ado, let's get into it. Good morning, Ahmed.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for making the time for this. I understand that you lead a very, very busy life, so we appreciate the time that you've dedicated towards our little passion project over here.
Thank you.
So I'm going to, for anyone who's not seen the work from Archidentity, you are definitely missing out already in life as a designer. But for those of you who know the practice and the work that they do, it's definitely quite contemporary, quite modern, very focused on the residential sector of Dubai. So I guess my first question to you, Ahmed, is as an Emirati architect, the whole tradition of Emirati living is now being reinterpreted in a sense, kind of being modernized for, well, exactly people like yourself. So to you as an Emirati architect, what really is modern living or modern architecture for you at the moment?
That's a great question. First of all, thank you for the kind introduction. Well, I think we have a lot to say about our own architecture, and it is unfortunate that I see a lot of examples that in essence do not reflect our modern requirements, as you put it. However, I don't think it's totally to blame on either the client or the consultant themselves. However, there is no specific prototype, there is no legacy that has been drawn out. And I think that is the major issue. Most people don't know, you can say in simple terms, what they're missing out on. And you can say through the years of research and work that I have done, both in Japan and in the UAE, as we were talking earlier, I noticed a lot of similarities in terms of how Japan opened up to, you can say, to foreign concepts, whether to develop their city or to take it and to adapt it into their own language, because a lot of their languages also includes foreign words as well. So I think that was all during the time of the Meiji Restoration. So I think what I'm trying to say in very simple terms is that we were taught in university a lot of concepts about, this is one example. I mean, we were given a lot of vague terms such as genius loci or zeitgeist or axis mundi, or even if you go into other cultures such as feng shui or vastu. So all of these have a kind of spiritual connection. They are all attempting to create a timeless architecture through linking our own cultural concepts to a timeless concept. And you can only do that by looking at the history of our architecture, how it evolved, maybe between the 60s and the 80s. And then you will notice that there is no reference that could be worthy of contributing it to a legacy of works. And when I go back and I did my research before attempting to develop this kind of a new vocabulary, the only things that came to mind that were of essence or they had significance was the Dubai Municipality building, which...
That's a pretty cool looking building.
It is, and it is timeless. And I've already had some interviews regarding this building. A lot of people don't appreciate it, but in essence, it is timeless architecture in the sense that it is accessible all year round. It may not be the most conveniently air-conditioned space, however, it is accessible all year round. It is located next to the creek. It is raised on a platform. It is bringing in the northerly winds, and it's a shaded space continuously. And even if you look at the original publications by Japan Architect magazine at the time, and you look at interviews interviews with the architect himself, Kazuyuki Matsushita-san. He wrote that he wanted to create a meidan, a space of gathering that is not only accessible for certain times, but he wanted to propagate a new prototype. And I think I picked up on that simply by accident through my own research. Another surprise was looking at the Dubai Municipality building. You will notice that always there is one column off center. And I had no idea why. And I kept on doing research over and over again. I looked at those 4 columns holding up that shading structure. But why is that column off grid? Why is it at an angle? So finally, I don't know if this is true or not. Unfortunately, I didn't have the privilege to interview the architect, but I noticed that it's exactly located on the Qibla axis, which is 158 degrees from north. And I think that was whether true or not, in terms of the degrees and orientation, it is correct. You can't avoid it. And if you look at the prayer room within the Dubai Municipality building, it is oriented along that same major column. So for me, it's a fact. Regardless of this, I took that forward and I kind of had to reinterpret our own kind of vocabulary in a recent residential project, which I did for myself because an architect, the opportunity to design his own villa is basically to propagate this kind of new vocabulary. And if he can't do it in his own villa, then I don't know who will. So I took this as an opportunity and I took a lot of these concepts and I adapted it so that it could be a prototype for future residential buildings, which I think is in essence the core of all architecture. And it doesn't matter regardless of the scale. Even the vocabulary could be also translated into the Expo Live Pavilion, because one of our latest projects, which I invite everybody to go visit at Expo, it does encourage the kind of a modest and civic approach to architecture where you do interpret certain traditional prototypes in a symbolic sense. However, you make it accessible universally. I call it, in Japan, they have a term called local architecture, which is a combination of global and local. So you take the local and you propagate it to a global audience. So I think I've said enough. I mean, it's a very long process to ask an architect to translate his own philosophy. However, I just shared with you some examples, and I invite you also to visit some of our projects to kind of understand its essence and how it could be propagating the modern Emirati lifestyle, which is a combination of symbolic architecture, functional architecture, and contextual architecture. So one of the major challenges of any architect is to distinguish between what is aesthetic and what is purely functional and relevant. And unfortunately, we've continuously fallen into the same traps continuously. Another example I would like to share is windows and balconies. If you notice in Emirati houses, it's barely used, simply because the fact of the matter is that I believe that over the past, following the 80s, mostly in residential buildings, it's basically a repeated modules of residential buildings. It's much easier to replicate rather than to provide, to criticize and to filter out or redact out of the architecture. So in my opinion, balconies have no relevance unless it is inversed. So that is only one example. And in the end of any responsive architecture, and the conclusion of all my research, is that we have been designing in reverse the whole time. One of the most significant things as researchers visit the older districts in Al Fahidi area, such as the courtyard houses, they said that the most significant thing about our own local Emirati architecture is that you have the ability to walk on its outside and look back on it. So it's almost like you took a black hole and you throw it in the middle of a typical residential villa, meaning that if you have your plot of land, your 10,000 square feet or your 12,000 square feet of land or 15,000, you always have the gate and you enter the garden and then you enter the block, the residential block, when in fact it's much more complicated than that. The courtyard will always be in the center of the villa, and these are the traditional concepts that have always been evident within the country. I mean, everybody's been to Al Fahidi area and they know its significance, but that transition that you go from outside into inside is timeless. The garden that you see when you walk in is timeless. You may not have the coral stones anymore because they're very scarce and they're protected now. But if you take these concepts and you translate it into a modern context, one thing I wanted also to highlight is that even embedded with our own religion, I mean, there's concepts of modesty, You should always be respectful of your neighbor. You don't need to show off to your neighbor. You need to be modest to them. So the external envelope is actually a secondary thought. It's more about simplifying it to its basic essentials so that you don't stand out from your neighbors. But on inside, that's where you put your money. That's where you try to create a lavish environment to share with your own family members and not exhibit it to the exterior audience, the civic society. And then if you look at, okay, we may not have all the embellished joinery works that come in from India with the doors and so forth. What is our modern material that we now have that we can interpret into the courtyard to express this lavishness, which in the end is glass and light. It's just basically glass and aluminium. That is then interpreted into the inner courtyard. And again, I'm talking mostly about my experience with designing my own villa, which took almost 11 years to complete. However, again, it matches the brief. You have an extremely simple villa from the outside that anybody could pass by, unless you have an eye for detail.
Yes.
And then you're encouraged to visit the inside where it's transformative space. Yeah, so I hope I was able to answer your question.
No, definitely. You've, I think within the first 5 minutes, given us a lot of food for thought already. So that's awesome. So many things that I want to talk about. So I'll just start one by one then. I guess the most relevant one, which I was thinking about was, yes, you're absolutely right. That whole experience when you enter a villa from your gate into the garden, the villa and so on. I completely agree. I think that an internal courtyard obviously has always worked and should continue to work here. Maybe this question needs to be answered by you putting on your authority hat now and not Archidentity. Obviously, as you know, one of the many regulations that villas and plots have is your typical 3-meter setback and so on and so forth. Makes it difficult for architects to design. Of course, there are ways around it with exceptions and so on, but the general sort of DCR that's put in place for most villa developments is that you need to have these setbacks off the plots and so on. Do you think that maybe if that were to be revisited and rethought, do you think that will then open up the sort of design arena for architects to explore a bit more?
Well, the advantage of wearing both hats as an authority as well as an architect, you learn the value of respecting regulations. A lot of it is due to privacy between neighbors. And if you think about it, the 3 meter on each side translate into 6 meters between villa and neighboring building, which would be in this case a villa.
Facade, yeah.
Exactly. And allowing certain encroachments of balcony projections within that, I think are essentials in terms of what we have been attuned to by now in terms of privacy and so forth. Do I always agree that it should be applied without any kind of specific contextual relevance? I don't believe so. However, that's why we have our plot regulations where the authority should be informed beforehand in terms of any type of special requirements to avoid exceptions to which again translate into costs for the client. But I myself worked around the 3-meter setback and I still was able to apply the courtyard typology very well. Personally, I believe 3 meters can now, this is of course from a personal level, I think there should be some flexibility maybe between 3 to 1.5 meters. I think a lot of it has now been translated between annex or the service block between the building. But eventually, with the urbanizing that's going to affect the city post-COVID, hopefully, and following the expo, we really need to capitalize on every square foot that we can. And I think people need to get used to being more congested in space. We do have a lavish space in general. If you compared with any international, any country around the globe, I think cities are becoming much more urbanized and we don't have the luxury of space as we do now. Basically, in summary, you can still work around the authority regulations and achieve the intention of your architecture and your vision. But I think it needs to be hand in hand with some flexibility also offered from authorities in terms of what leniency can be granted and update maybe regulations based on our current demand.
Right. Do you think that that's a conversation which maybe designers, consultants need to have with authorities? Or do you think this needs more research from authorities? Do you think it needs more of a dialogue? I mean, what's in your mind maybe a tangible step that can be taken in order to maybe bridge this gap of requirements, or maybe clients saying, this is what we want, and authorities listening to that in some way?
Well, in the end, if you need to get something done, you need the higher authority to instruct the other authorities to follow suit. That is the end conclusion. I do believe that there are requirements for higher engagement between the residents, to actually have a channel in which they can raise their queries to authorities.
Right.
I think they do have the right to. However, from what I see from all the applications that we review on a daily basis, a lot of it is a struggle to differentiate between self-gain versus the common gain. And the only way that we can do that is to list down repeated comments being raised by the residents. And then maybe once triggered, we can conduct research into that and then develop updated regulations to respond to that. So I think, that's about it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Another topic which comes up quite often on the podcast is this whole idea of the city of Dubai sort of becoming these islands of places. So you have, Knowledge Village and Media City and Arabian Ranches and Sustainable City and so on and so forth. There's this idea that architects are now talking about that we need to stitch these islands together into the urban fabric, in the sense that we don't want it to be sort of segregated by highways or even sikkahs for that matter, that there isn't really a public civic realm to kind of connect these two. Is this something which you are also thinking about now?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at all the publications and relevant material which I've been interviewed on, I've always propagated the idea of stitching the city back together in a literal sense. And I'm lucky enough to be part of the promoting the accessibility and well-being as part of the Dubai Plan 2040, in which I'm also engaged in. I think it's not only a matter of stitching the city back together. I think that's essential, but we really need to understand that it has to work hand in hand between all authorities, because if you want to apply a pure TOD system to Dubai, which is a transit-oriented development, it needs to be a full life cycle between when you depart your home to go to your work and all the way back from work back to your home. You're trying to achieve the concept of a 15 or 20-minute city. I think in our case, we have chosen to go with the 20-minute city prototype. So as you know, Dubai 2040 paves the way for that in terms of the 6 city districts which have been established. And also it's all, it's in the news. So they also have highlighted that as part of the structure. And those macro cities, I mean, you can basically say the whole city will be grouped out into 3 major clusters. And those are also interconnected between each other. So it will reduce this kind of bubble cities, as you put it. But I think in terms of connecting them all back together, we really need to ask difficult questions such as the relevance of shopping malls. As you know, globally, the shopping malls are struggling, and the pandemic also did not help that. But if you go to any highly urbanized districts in cities like Hong Kong or Japan or Korea, they don't have the privilege of building many new buildings, but what they do is they repurpose them. And the footfall in the end is determinant of their profitability. Basically, again, just very simply put, if you wake up in the morning, you would want to get ready. You would go on a bicycle to a metro station. If it's a bit far away from you, you would take the electric scooter. You would park that in a designated area, would hop on the metro. And from there, either you've already taken your electric scooter with you, or you have your other bicycle parked at that area, which takes you to the workplace. And once you're done, you would take again a similar mode of transportation that will take you into a shopping mall. Let's call it a shopping mall for now. But what you would care about mostly is to get your daily essentials. So the floor in which you arrive in on the metro would be where you would have your community facilities such as grocery shopping, you would have your gym, and these are the kind of the daily routines. And all your flagship stores would be distributed on the higher levels and the lower levels of the building, if not having then the roof gardens at the top. So I think that is a system that has already been tried and true, and there's no way around it. I mean, we're just reaching this level where we're becoming highly urbanized, and we're in this transition phase. As you know, we have one of the highest levels of car ownership around the world. So this system will automatically fail if we don't reorient the city to become transit oriented rather than being car dependent. And we can also also notice it now as the schools have opened, all the bottlenecks in the roads have shown up. Yeah.
Yep.
And also in terms of the bridges and so forth. The question that always comes to thought is, okay, we spent so much time making these raised bridges for the roads, and then you see these poor people on the bicycles on the side of the road. I mean, don't you think there should be at least a lane on the bridge dedicated to those cyclists? So I think people notice that, and thank God for the Dubai Plan 2040, which are asking these difficult questions. And I think hopefully in the next decade, we'll see it come to fruition. Yeah.
Awesome. I think as a designer like myself, as an architect in this city, it's very reassuring and very motivating to know that, authorities are sort of asking these questions and thinking about something as simple as a cycle lane. It's something which obviously anyone who's been to other parts of the world sees that it not only functions, but actually adds another layer to the entire city in the way that you interact with it, experience it, and so on, as compared to just, driving by at 80 kilometers an hour, for example. So I think that's very cool. I maybe want to take a step back and talk about your villa, which I think was quite interesting because in my opinion, I think that's one of the hardest projects which any architect can do. And the fact that it took 11 years for you, I think makes a lot of sense. I think if I were to do it, it would be more or less the same timeline. But my question to you is, because obviously you are sort of pushing boundaries in a sense when it comes to obviously planning, but even things like materiality and so on and so forth. Just to give the listeners a bit of context, if you've been in the Archidentity office, we're actually sitting in the middle of basically an entire material lab. So I can see that you clearly give a lot of attention to things of that nature. So my question to you is, when you deal with suppliers, contractors mainly, how are they sort of interpreting this new direction of modern architecture? Because over the last maybe decade or so before, it was kind of a, cookie cutter. We have a recipe, we have a spec document which works. We're just going to do that and that's fine. But with designers like yourself sort of breaking away from that, do you find a lot of friction when working with contractors on these kind of projects?
Yeah. I mean, there's a friction every single step of the way. And I think the main thing is to translate the passion into any stakeholder that's involved in the visioning of your project. And I've had even the painters working in my villa. I mean, they were always wondering about this concrete bare walls. Like they always ask me, are you going to paint it eventually or not? And I kept on fighting back at them, like, don't touch this wall, don't touch it, and only after it's been completed now they said, I always thought about this gray wall, but now that it's done, I'm really I'm having a change of thought, and I think this is what we have to do. Of course, in my villa, I call it the negative space. Basically, I mean, it's difficult to explain. You have to visit it, but it's basically a block with a large courtyard cut out oriented towards the Qibla. And whenever when the two spaces connect, I call it negative space, which is the timeless space, which is the oriented towards Qibla space, which is the bare concrete space. So I think that's something that I always missed in every villa and every place. If you break down our daily lives as Emiratis, it's structured around 5 prayers. These 5 prayers, you spend almost 15 minutes, if not 20 minutes in a congregational prayer. And even before that, you perform ablution to get ready for that prayer. It was never celebrated, unfortunately. It's always an afterthought in malls. You always find the Qibla in this kind of a weird axis where you're not sure which direction to be. Yes. Even my kids, they always say, I want to pray now. Which direction do I pray? Is it a bit to the right, bit to the left? And that was my realization that, that is our genius loci. That is our axis. And whenever you're oriented to that axis, everything is amplified. So why isn't it celebrated? Why isn't it showcased? Yeah. Why isn't it highlighted? So now I don't need to do anything. I just walk into the villa and I see that oriented, lodged, bare concrete corner, and I always say, just face that. You're linked with the whole. Right. You're linked with the whole culture, with the cohesive system that is all reaching one single point on the global map. So I think that's beautiful, and I think it's unfortunate that something that we do 5 times a day takes almost, let's just say it takes a maximum of 30 minutes, times that by 5, that's your day. That's your day.
Right.
And that is, if you think of it as common terms, that's your relaxation time.
True.
That's your yoga. You see it however you see it, from any faith that you see it. It's your cleansing. Us with our urbanized lifestyles, and the question which you're planning to ask about balancing life between daily requirements and still maintain your comfort, your relaxation. This is what it is, in essence.
Right. No, I think you led perfectly into my next question. So I'm just going to give a bit of context to our listeners again before you answer, which is, most people find it very hard to balance their personal life with a career. Generally, architects and designers find that even harder. And you've sort of taken it to another level wherein you actually have 2 full-time roles, which you maintain with an authority and with Archidentity. So the question is, Ahmed, how do you do it?
That's actually a common question everybody asks me, but to put it in simple terms, I think it's first important to answer why I established the firm. And I think it just says that our ethos and our theme has never remained, it's never been disrupted. It's always unchanged, which is you need to create an identity. You need to create an identity. And the reason for the term identity is a combination of, you can say, timeless architecture, and at the same time significant architecture and responsive architecture. And I did not want to name it with any specific name, because I believe it's a universal message regardless of which culture you're in. And we all know what is an identity. We know what makes us unique despite of our background and our culture. In each essence, if you go to India, if you go to Philippines, if you go to anywhere, we all know what is our language, that we speak. And that translates into built form regardless. So, and that's what I wanted to propagate. I noticed that a lot of the developments here are not capturing what I have just explained in the previous answer. We have so much potential to evolve and to create a truly global language, which in the end could be, that's what I argue. Is that we have a global message locally that can translate into a global context, which is with the COVID era. People are going to be they need to have this kind of a transience between inside space and outside space. They need to be active. They need to feel comfortable. Whenever you feel that you need to, you can say, isolate in a house. We all know the difference between being isolated in a apartment block without any natural light, or to be isolated in a more luxurious space where you actually have this integration between outside and inside. You have ventilation, you have natural light, and these are all the things that we neglected. And that's also you should consider, even when creating DCRs for master plans. There is an essence that you need to capture, and you should not neglect it, which is the solar orientation of a development, the natural light created from that development, and the breezes that come in. And it shouldn't be only on a 2D diagram. We have the technology and the means to know exactly at what time the sun will cast at what certain point on that ground. So these are the questions that are affecting all our developments now from a master development level, where it was propagated as a kind of attraction. But now comes the reality, whereas how is this place going to be accessible all year round? And if we don't resolve that, we're going to continue falling into the same potholes that we have been doing until now. And I think these questions, unfortunately, were learned the hard way. But again, I'm always very optimistic about the new plans that I see going around in the city, such as the Dubai Plan 2040, as well as you notice these villas coming up in our districts. They always pop out, and there are significant architects, or I wouldn't say significant, but architects that are responsive to the climate, and people notice that. And I think that's what a change is coming. It's just a matter of time.
Couldn't agree more. I think anyone who's practiced in this region for the last decade or so clearly saw what it was and saw what it's becoming. So absolutely. I kind of want to draw focus then to Archidentity as a firm, as a practice. At the moment, I'm not sure if you can discuss it or not. Maybe it's under an NDA, but is there any one particular project which you're really, really excited about, which is doing something really different? I know, of course, you have, the Expo Live Pavilion, which is, if anyone's not seen it, I highly recommend you go check it out. Either that or anything else which is currently on the design table, which is of real interest to you.
Again, it's going back to the messages and the language that I've propagated in my own villa. It's been a struggle. Most of the villas that we design complete on the full life cycle within 2 years. When you compare 11 years to 2 years, you can just understand the stress that I was under. And it is a culmination of 3 years of research. And you can say, it's 3 years of research even beforehand, even before the 11-year construction period. So if you take that from research to design to implementation, it has been honestly, I would consider it a milestone in my life in terms of achieving what I think a language that could actually be translated into something mainstream. And I'm not only saying it because it was my own villa. If I found a client that was supporting such a concept, I would have happily given it to them and it would have finished in less than a quarter of the time. It's much easier to design for clients than to design for yourself, honestly. And perfection is never going to be achieved. Even now, if I look back at it, I think there's 100 things I could have done differently. But the final message, the outcome is there. It's definitely very clear and profound, and it will be heard. So it's basically my own villa. And again, it's not only the 11-year design and construction period, it's the 3 years of research that went into it. And I'd like to go into more research about what kind of inspired this, maybe would be more beneficial to the audience, was because when I studied in Japan, actually, it was mostly to do with the research of the works of Kenzo Tange. So Kenzo Tange, as you know, was a very famous modernist architecture. He was part of the metabolism movement that kind of promoted the kind of Corbusian elite kind of utopia of the city of the future. Just to make things simpler and to put a quick conclusion to this is that in Japan, you have every single architect interpreting their own identity and their own culture in a multitude of ways. It's very unfortunate for us not to have similar accessibility to these kind of responses where you interpret something called, in Japanese terms, the tea house or the sukiya zukuri. And the sukiya zukuri is basically the tea house design or the residential design. And I was lucky enough to study in Kyoto, which is basically they use machiya style. So machiya is basically little townhouses. They had they were always being taxed on the frontage towards the main road. So what they were forced to do is to create a very narrow frontage and to create a very deep depth to it. So they were always challenged by bringing in natural light, and they were always kind of promoting that. So that kind of exposure to these kinds of buildings, the meandering to reach these, because they're so deep, you have to always create these little courtyard pockets to bring in this natural light. That in combination with the whole evolving of above the metabolism movement, where people started to question, is this kind of brutalist theory really capturing our own identity in Japan, in the Japanese context? So the response to that was kind of a fine-tuning of this modernist concept to be locally rooted. And I think they did it in a multitude of ways. They established the tatami system, and they established the kind of a specific grid system. And I think these are things that can be adapted to our own local architecture. Yes, a lot of things may not be relevant from the old Fahidi houses that we're used to. However, their essence are universal. And it's transformative in a way. The wind tower may not have functional relevance right now. However, it could, in my context, what we did was we created a light tower that brings in a lot of light. So that's one example. I'm saying it may not be a language which is the single solution to every problem. However, by it being a vocabulary where people can pick and choose from and interpret it in their own ways, I think that would be essential to take architecture forward, especially in the field of residential design, simply to save costs for the client and provide something that is usable rather than a decoration.
I think as listeners of the show, and me myself, to be honest, we can't wait to see this villa. To be honest, it sounds like a place which you should probably set up a tour for most architects over here. Sounds really awesome. Ahmed, you're very famously known for saying that you need to get the residential typology right. And if you get that right, then you can pretty much design anything. Do you still stand by that?
Yes, 100%. Whenever you design a residence, every single challenge comes ahead of you. And it's basically, I call it the Rosetta Stone of all languages. If you get it right, you can get everything else right. Because everybody knows, every architect that starts out in the industry within the first 5-10 years, their aim is always to go into commercial. It's much easier, it's less headache. You get your return on investment much faster. And the client is not so focused too much on the spiritual aspect of any development. Their gain is mostly to launch it as soon as possible in the market to get the return on investment. So I think definitely, it's unchanged. Residential is one of the most challenging things. And that's why I'm happy that we're still struggling with every project. We keep on learning and we keep on evolving as a firm. And in the end, people never look at the struggles along the way, but they always look at the final product. When you live in it and you experience it, it transforms anything and gives also, personally, me, self-satisfaction that I've contributed to this family living in this villa and they're enjoying it. They may not be attuned to every single detail, but for me, I think that just gives me, you can say, the battery to keep on going. That gives me happiness and comfort in what I do, and to keep on balancing between the two roles that I practice on a daily basis.
Awesome. Ahmed, as a sort of final question to round off this interview, you seem like someone who's obviously given and continues to give a lot of thought to architecture, someone who's definitely seen and been inspired by a lot of Japanese architecture also, obviously. So we call this question the dinner question, which is pretty self-explanatory. If you had the option to sit down and have dinner with any architect that you want to, who would that person be and why?
It wouldn't be an architect. It would be actually a round table, because the conclusion of my research would be that the language is still yet to be written, and I know the key stakeholders that I need around that table. Unfortunately, I look too much in the past, and a lot of the people that would like to sit with are no longer with us. But they have contributed, their language has. And I would just name a few architects that I think have contributed significantly to my own development in terms of research. I haven't met many of them, but a few I have met. I mean, to me, from the Arab continent, I would talk about Muhammad Makiya. I would talk about Ja'far Tukan. Those are some from the prominent Arab architects that I have researched. From Japan, I would say Kenzo Tange and his professor before him. In Japanese, they say you always have a senpai and you have a kohai. So his senpai was Kunio Maekawa, which I think really contributed to a lot of the beautiful architecture even before him. And of course, Tadao Ando, which I had the privilege of meeting on more than one occasion. That would say from the Japanese side. And then, of course, you have the well-known architects. Louis Kahn, I think for me, he always plays a strong relevant in terms of the projects that he's created. And the grid system, which I think for him, the grid was not only about a grid, it was an art piece in itself. Yeah, I think these are some of the architects that come to mind. And I think you need to get a conglomerate together to get a final conclusion to what is Emirati architecture. And I think what's important to highlight is that even for my own realization, bringing all these people together onto one table, I think just shows how much significance and potential our local Emirati architecture has to transform. And I think it is really important for people to recognize that we are so diluted in kind of prototypes that are exported, whereas we have a jewel, the crowning jewel sitting next door. So I think to explore that, develop that, I think first of all we need to realize it ourselves before we can showcase that to the globe as a whole. And I'm happy about also, Dubai Expo happening right now, which I think it's coming out of the COVID era. I think it will pave the way for that. So I'm very excited about that.
Agreed. Ahmed, so much to think about in this episode. This has been one of the most thought-provoking ones I think that we've had yet. And on behalf of the show, I want to thank you so much for giving us the time. I understand that's very, very important to you. And we will definitely have you on the show again, for sure, I can tell. And for the rest of you guys, thank you so much for listening. And we will catch you guys next week. Fellow aFormers, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for being part of our journey. And thank you for the immense support we've been receiving for our episodes. It has and continues to be a very bumpy road, but we wouldn't want it any other way. If you enjoyed this episode and it brought you value, please share this episode with anyone who may benefit from it. But of course, if you loved the episode, follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn, send us a little DM, and we may just send you a secret link to a secret episode which we've been working on. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. See you next time. Keep sketching.